A man died under a police officer's knee, and the world changed. 4 years ago today, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. His final words, "I can't breathe," became a global rallying cry. But why on this anniversary is his name trending again? And what does a death in America have to do with us here in Kenya? This isn't just history. This is a live wire, and the current is still flowing. We're going deep on the legacy, the backlash, and the undeniable connections to our own streets. Stay with us. To understand why this anniversary matters, we must go back to May 25, 2020. George Perry Floyd Jr., a 46-year-old Black American, was arrested outside a Minneapolis corner shop. The allegation? Using a counterfeit $20 bill. What followed was a 9-minute and 29-second ordeal, captured entirely on a teenager's phone. Officer Derek Chauvin knelt on Floyd's neck and back. Bystanders pleaded. Floyd called for his mother. He lost consciousness. He was pronounced dead later at the hospital. But this was not an isolated incident. It was a catalyst. It ignited a powder keg of centuries of systemic racism and police brutality in the United States. Names like Eric Garner, Breonna Taylor, and Michael Brown had already become tragic hashtags, but Floyd's death was different. The video was horrifyingly clear. It was prolonged. It was undeniable. And it happened in the middle of a global pandemic, when people were already isolated, angry, and glued to their screens. The key players were immediately thrust into a global spotlight. Derek Chauvin, the white officer with his knee on Floyd's neck, 3 other officers who stood by and did not intervene. The Minneapolis Police Department, which initially described the incident as a medical incident during police interaction. And then, the most powerful player of all, the public. Ordinary citizens with phones, who filmed, who protested, who demanded justice. The timeline was rapid and seismic. The video went viral within hours. Protests began in Minneapolis that very night. Within 72 hours, demonstrations erupted in every state in America, and within a week they were global. From London to Nairobi, from Sydney to Rio, millions took to the streets under the banner of Black Lives Matter. This was the context, a single act of violence, magnified by technology, meeting a world ready to explode with pent-up frustration over inequality. The core facts are now part of the historical record. The official autopsy and an independent autopsy both concluded the death was a homicide. The key statistic? 9 minutes and 29 seconds. That's how long Chauvin applied pressure. For over 3 of those minutes, Floyd was non-responsive. The world watched a man be killed in real time. Official responses were initially defensive, then scrambled. The Minneapolis police chief called the officers' actions contrary to our ethics. All 4 officers were fired, but the public demanded arrests. It took 4 days of escalating, fiery protests for Derek Chauvin to be charged with third-degree murder and manslaughter. The charges were later upgraded to second-degree murder. The other 3 officers were charged with aiding and abetting. The trial in 2021 was a global media event. The prosecution's case was built on that viral video, frame by agonizing frame. They brought medical experts who testified that Floyd died from low oxygen or asphyxia due to the restraint. The defense argued underlying health conditions and drug use were the cause. But in a landmark verdict, Derek Chauvin was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 22.5 years in prison. Later, in federal court, all 4 officers were convicted of violating Floyd's civil rights. Expert analysis at the time focused on the blue wall of silence being broken. The Minneapolis police chief himself testified against Chauvin, calling his use of force totally unnecessary. Policing experts called it a textbook case of excessive force. But the deeper analysis pointed to systemic issues, inadequate training on de-escalation, implicit bias, and the militarization of police departments. The video was the evidence, but the trial put the entire system of American policing in the dock. However, the story of George Floyd's legacy is not one of unified perspective. There is a powerful and vocal opposition viewpoint. In the United States, a significant political and social movement pushed back against the Black Lives Matter protests. All Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter became counter-slogans. Critics argued the protests were violent, pointing to instances of looting and property damage. They framed Chauvin as a rogue cop, not a symbol of systemic failure. Some media commentators and politicians downplayed the role of race, arguing it was simply a case of a bad apple. This backlash crystallized into political action. A powerful narrative of law and order gained traction. Legislation was proposed in many U.S. states to increase penalties for protesting, not to reform policing. The concept of critical race theory, an academic framework for examining systemic racism, became a national political battleground, with dozens of states moving to ban its teaching in schools. For many observers, the conviction of Chauvin was not the end, but the beginning of a fierce cultural war over how history, race, and justice are understood. Internationally, the reactions were a mirror. In Kenya, the protests were deeply resonant. Citizens here drew direct parallels to our own experiences with police brutality. The hashtag #StopPoliceBrutalityKE trended alongside Black Lives Matter. We saw videos of our own police enforcing COVID curfews with violence. The names of victims like Baby Pendo, Yasin Moyo, and others were invoked. The global movement gave a language and a framework to local grievances. It wasn't just solidarity with America, it was a moment of stark recognition. The same patterns of state power, impunity, and the devaluation of certain lives were visible on our own streets. The implications are profound. The Floyd anniversary forces a dual examination of America's ongoing racial reckoning and of our own societal contracts with security forces. It asks whether global movements can create lasting local change. It highlights how social media can both unite a global community and deepen domestic divisions. The deeper analysis shows that Floyd's death became a Rorschach test. What you see in that video, a tragic accident, a criminal murder, or a systemic symptom, depends entirely on your worldview. So how does this affect ordinary people in America and here in Kenya? The impact is tangible and daily. In the US, for communities of color, it reinforced a deep-seated fear and distrust of law enforcement. Parents had new, horrifying material for the talk they give their children about surviving police encounters. But it also galvanized a generation of activists. Voter registration drives saw historic turnouts. Municipal budgets were scrutinized with calls to defund the police, meaning reallocate some funds to social services, mental health responders, and community programs, gaining serious, though controversial, traction. Some cities did ban chokeholds and no-knock warrants. For ordinary white Americans, it was for many a brutal, unavoidable education in privilege and systemic bias. Economically, corporations faced immense pressure. Millions in donations were pledged to racial justice groups. Diversity, equity, and inclusion departments expanded overnight. Brands scrambled to show alignment, sometimes leading to accusations of empty, woke washing. The conversation about racial inequality entered boardrooms in a way it never had before. In Kenya, the impact was a powerful amplification. Ordinary citizens, activists, and journalists felt emboldened to document and call out police excesses. The social and political ramifications were direct. The National Police Service was forced into rare public statements defending its conduct. The conversation shifted from isolated incidents to a pattern of behavior. It fueled demands for the full implementation of the National Police Service Act, for independent oversight bodies like the IPOA to have real teeth, and for comprehensive police reform that goes beyond rhetoric. For the family of a Boda Boda rider shot at a roadblock or a market trader beaten for violating curfew, George Floyd's story was not foreign news. It was a stark reminder of their own vulnerability. What happens next? The work is unfinished. In the US, the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, a major federal reform bill, has stalled in Congress. Police unions remain powerful. The cultural divide is wider than ever. In Kenya, police reform is a slow, grinding process against institutional inertia. The anniversary is not a celebration, but a checkpoint. It's a moment to ask, have the policies changed? Has the culture changed? Or has the world simply moved on to the next crisis? What are experts saying on this anniversary? The consensus is one of cautious, sober assessment. Dr. Kehinde Andrews, a professor of Black Studies, argues that while the protests were the largest in history, transforming the system that killed George Floyd requires revolutionary change, not just reform. He warns against mistaking visibility for victory. In Kenya, constitutional lawyer Lempa Sayanka draws the direct line: the value of life in the margins of society is contested everywhere. Floyd's murder was a global teachable moment on state power. In Kenya, it removed the excuse of ignorance. We can no longer say, this is just how it is. We saw our reality reflected in an American street, and it forced a collective introspection we are still navigating. Comparisons are being made to other landmark moments, like the South African anti-apartheid movement, which also galvanized global solidarity. But experts note a key difference. The digital speed and visual horror of Floyd's death created an immediate, visceral global response that bypassed traditional media gatekeepers. Predictions are mixed. Some forecast a slow but steady push for accountability, powered by continued citizen journalism. Others fear reform fatigue and a backlash that will harden positions. The forecast for Kenya specifically hinges on sustained civic pressure. Experts say the connection made in 2020 between a street in Minneapolis and a street in Mathare must be actively maintained. The demand for professional, humane, and accountable policing is a universal one. The anniversary reminds us that the fight for that standard is a continuous one, not a one-time protest. The key takeaway? George Floyd's name trends on this anniversary because his death was a beginning, not an end. It started a global conversation about justice that is still unresolved. What to watch for is not just American politics, but our own. Watch for police reform bills in our parliament. Watch for IPOA investigations. Watch for how we treat the most vulnerable on our streets. The legacy of one man's tragic death is the ongoing struggle for dignity everywhere. This story is still being written. Subscribe to Kenya News Update today for more breaking news and deep analysis on the stories that connect our world.